Good morning, everybody, and welcome again back to the Pineland Speaker Series. We're very lucky today. We have Claude Epstein with us again. He's a longtime professor and longtime Pineland short course presenter. Many years he's worked with us. And today we're going to learn about the civilian experience of the American Revolutionary War in southern New Jersey. And it's going to be, tied in with Independence Day coming up here in a couple days. So I was talking to Claude and he told me he had this presentation. I thought it would be really neat to kind of look into what was going on in southern New Jersey during the Revolutionary War with New York and Philadelphia. We were kind of right in the middle. And as Claude uses this, it's living in the war zone. And that's really, what was happening here during that Revolutionary War. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Claude. And I'll see you guys on the backside.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. It's really strange to talk at my computer screen and not see any people. So it's an odd experience, but I'll press on. I was watching television, and before the COVID stuff came on, there was a lot of material about what was going on in Syria. And the picture on the lower left shows an apartment building that was bombed. And that really struck me because you see apartment buildings all the time. They're not such an unusual thing. But when they are destroyed and they're still partially standing, it really is kind of riveting. It's like that situation in Florida today. So what I got to thinking was that their people's apartments were destroyed, people's businesses were destroyed, the schools, the hospitals, all of the services disappeared. And it was in an urban setting, and lots of people got displaced. So you can see that the two little children are playing in a camp that was set up for the dispossessed people. And there's a camp down in the lower right showing where all these people went. So during a war, lots and lots of regular people get displaced. And so that was kind of running through my head when I saw this on television. Now, I don't know if you've seen Turn or not. It's a great series about the American Revolution and some of the spy activity that was going on in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. And the thing that struck me about this was a lot of the people who were being portrayed in this show were just regular people. They weren't the big heroes, the big generals, the big political figures. They're just regular people. And I put the two things together and it suddenly struck me. What were the regular people in New Jersey doing during the American Revolution? Every year of the American Revolution, there was some kind of military activity going on in New Jersey. And so if you were just living here in a farm or in a small town, what were you experiencing during this time? And so I put this talk together to get more of a sense of what life was like during the American Revolution in South Jersey. Now, this is just a picture of life before the revolution. It's, of course, idealized. But what you can see in the upper right is a guy cutting down trees and building a log cabin. You see on the lower right, a family harvesting hay. On the upper left, you see women and children in the house, the women doing housework, which was considerable then. And then in the lower left, what you have is people gathering fruit to make preserves and jellies. So these are the kinds of activities that went on just sort of normally in lots of parts of South Jersey. Now, there were also community things that were developing. The lower left is a Friends meeting house, very common all over South Jersey. The upper left is a tavern where people would meet and socialize. The upper right was another kind of religious meeting house. And the lower left, this is actually from Cumberland County, was a harbor that was constructed. So a lot of the travel at this time was by boat. And so a lot of the shoreline had to be altered to be landings and harbors. And so you can see that kind of construction going on too. This is more on a municipal scale. Then on an even larger scale, you start to see cities being developed. So that's Philadelphia in the upper left. and you could see all of the shipping that was going on. Roads were very poor then, and the only way to transport people and goods was by ship. So Philadelphia became a major harbor. People didn't stay in the city too long, and so you start to see other cities being built or towns being built outside of Philadelphia. And that's what's on the lower left. This is one of the more rural towns developing. And then you see people moving further and further away from Philadelphia, further west, and you can see Conestoga wagons and all of that sort of thing. So there was a lot of activity going on for just in peacetime. Now, the war began, and what happened was people started to react to being having lots and lots of military stuff going on where they were. And this is a quote from a newspaper from January 29th, 1777. And he's talking about the British troops in New Jersey. Their rage and lust, their avarice and cruelty knew no bounds, and murder, ravishment, plunder, and the most brutal treatment of every sex and age were the first acts that signaled their conquest. And if such were their outrages on the partial subjugation of a few villages, good God, what consummate wretchedness is in store for the state over which the power shall be fully established. So even then, people began to get very, very nervous about what might happen. All of a sudden, thousands of soldiers would be living where they're living. They'd be camping out on their farms. And some of the things that they were concerned about was the abuse of the civilians by the Tories. In other words, the patriots themselves were very concerned about the pro-British factions that lived among them. And the pro-British factions tended to be more established and had more of a relationship with the king. And the Whigs, the Americans, had a rougher time of it. And so they became rather obstreperous and started to attack the Tories in their town. They started to destroy property. The lower left picture is them destroying properties inside the big houses, the fancy houses. They would conscript civilian goods. They go to a house and they said, we need blankets, we need shoes, and they just took them. The prices of goods became really inflated. One of the things that the British tried to do was pay top dollar to the farmers and merchants. And by doing so, they tried to cut down plunder by their troops, and it didn't work. So other things that happened was arson, houses were burned down, cattle was stolen. So if you had living out on a farm somewhere and the troops came through, it was like a big vacuum cleaner sucking up all of your resources to take care of the army. Now, the Hessians were a different problem. The Hessians were hired by the English to fight along with them against the Americans. And this was a quote from one of the books about what the Hessians were like. The Hessians in particular, being entirely mercenary and influenced by no feelings of sympathy, plundered, burned, and destroyed everything that came in their way without distinguishing between friend or foe. The people of all parties were insulted and abused in their own house. Their dwellings were rifled. Their women were oftentimes ravished by brutal soldiers, and neither smiling infancy nor a decrepit age possessed immunity from their outrages. Now, part of the problem with the soldiers, if you look at the people who weren't the officers, just the regular privates in the British Army, the privates in the Hessian Army, they weren't getting much money. And so to supplement their income, it was worth their while to plunder the civilians living around them. So this was not an unusual event. This is one of the ways that they supplemented their income. Now, this is a chart that shows the military atrocities that occurred in various towns in New Jersey. And you can see that most of the ones on the top are from really central Jersey, Princeton, Pennington, Somerset County, but the lower ones are more South Jersey. The brown lines represent that the atrocity was committed by the British. The light blue indicates that the atrocity was committed by the Americans. And so you can see that there was plunder, abuse, murder, assault, houses burned, stolen property, destroyed property, livestock stolen, spread diseases, sex crimes, displaced persons, what is that? Inhabitants, and inhabited estates confiscated. So these are the kinds of atrocities that were occurring. And I'll talk about some of these as we proceed. But you can see that it was happening on both sides. Now, the American Revolution in New Jersey can be broken down into two parts. The first part, from 1776 to 1778, was basically military actions occurring across New Jersey. Whole armies were crossing New Jersey, and so the people who were living here had to deal with massive numbers of people who were strangers to their place, who had certain demands they were making of the populace. Now, this just shows the numbers we're talking about. The American forces in New Jersey from 1776 to 1777 varied anywhere from about 31,000 down to 3,000. So there was a lot of changes in the American army, and there were some reasons for that. The British army, you can see, had about 13,000 people in total at about the same time in New Jersey, so that the numbers were anything from slightly in favor of the colonists to slightly in favor of the British. Now, it's not just a matter of thousands of strangers coming into the area. All of the armies required things in order to exist. It was the logistics of battle. So both sides had to have money to pay the soldiers. They needed to have artillery. They needed to have rifles and arms. They needed to have uniforms. They needed to have shoes. Shoes became a very important thing, especially for the American army. They needed to have horses. They needed to have wagons. They needed to have rum. Rum was a very constant need for both armies. They needed shelter, like these log cabins. They needed lots of food. And then they needed lots of domestic services, like cooking and cleaning clothing and objects, tailoring, and probably some other things which are of lesser quality, which happened in the troops. So there were all of these activities that had to happen when you have an army moving into your area. Now, one of the things I had to think about was that today, if you need to go somewhere or to transport something, you get a car or a truck and you do it. And the thing about that is, if you want to feed your car or your truck, you have to go to the gas station and get gasoline. There were no cars and trucks back then. There were only horses and other livestock. And so to transport things like armies, you needed fodder, you needed wheat to feed your horses and feed your other livestock. And so a major part of farming at that time in the 18th century involved raising forage for your animals. And so this was another thing that you had to supply your troops with. Now, the cost of the amount of food that you needed was also pretty monumental. These are just some figures that show what the British Army food requirement was for 60 to 90,000 troops for a year. And you could see they needed 80 million pounds of bread, flour, and rice, 11 million pounds of salt, beef, and so on and so on. You can see that these are large, large quantities of materials that the British needed to take care of their people. Washington had some figures also for his troops at Valley Forge, and they needed 20 million pounds of meat, and 100,000 barrels of flour. So you just think about what's the logistics? How do you get that stuff? Now, the British had the advantage of they could always ship stuff in from the colonies that hadn't rebelled, Canada and Florida and the Caribbean, and from England. The Americans didn't have that advantage. Now, another big thing, which I never really thought about this before, you have all of these strangers coming into New Jersey and they don't know where anything is. They need to find out, how do you get to so-and-so and where is this town and what roads do you take? So a lot of the military had to rely on the locals to find out, first of all, where the other army was. And so they had to receive information and pass information on so that each army could know something about where the other troops were located. They had to find people, ask people directions. And so sometimes at night, their troops would come in and they would get directions from the locals. And sometimes they even needed guidance. And so they would get somebody to show them the way. They also would occasionally capture people. So the American militia, for instance, in this case on the lower left, this is the capture of Major Andre, who was a British spy and a major officer in the British Army. And he was captured by American militia. Then there were spies. You needed the individuals to be spies. And so you had the Culper Ring in New York, New Jersey, getting information to Washington. And then you have in Virginia, this man, James Armstead Lafayette, who was a major American spy down there. People didn't regard him as dangerous because they thought he was a slave. And the white people would talk in front of slaves as if they didn't exist. And so he gathered a lot of intelligence, which he passed on to the American cause. Okay, now I'm going to start really talking about things in New Jersey with Washington's retreat from New York. And what you can see by the blue line is Washington being forced out of Manhattan up into Westchester County, crossing the river at, oh, I can't read the thing here. He crosses the river up the Hudson River, and then comes down through New Jersey. And it looks like he's taking the turnpike, which didn't exist then. But the route is kind of that way. It's from Northeast Jersey down to Trenton. So Washington's troops are being forced across New Jersey in 1776. As they go along, of course, they're taking supplies from the locals. Occasionally, the troops would get drunk, commit various kinds of assaults and plunder. They were being followed by the British and the Hessians, who were doing the same thing. So it was kind of like locusts crossing North Jersey, really assaulting a lot of people. Now, in addition, the people who were living in New Jersey were divided. So there were a lot of people who were pro-British. There were a lot of people who were pro-American. And each was suspicious of the other. This would sometimes turn out to be violent, and people's houses or barns were burned down. People would be injured, sometimes murdered, just by kind of the civil war that was going on at the same time. Now, that retreat across New Jersey ended around December. And I had to find out more about what happened at the Battle of Trenton. And one of the things was the English, for some reason, felt that the campaign against the Americans ended in December when the winter came on, because people didn't generally fight in the winter. So they weren't quite so interested in attacking Washington. They just wanted to keep their eye on him. So they established a British unit up in Princeton under General Grant, and two Hessian units, the ones in green, under Colonel Rahl in Trenton and Colonel von Donop in Bordentown. Now, Washington had come down to Trenton before the English and the Hessians got there. He sent his General Maxwell up and down the river to gather as many boats as he could and bring them to Trenton. And this was in preparation for the American army to ferry over to the Pennsylvania side. And so by doing that same thing, he not only got his troops out of New Jersey and into Pennsylvania, but he deprived the English and the Hessians of transportation across to attack him. So it was kind of a clever move to give himself some safety. And what you see is there are American units up at McConkey's Ferry, which is now Washington's Crossing, Newtown, Morrisville, and Bristol on the Pennsylvania side. And then in South Jersey, near Mount Holly, there were another group of Americans and militia down there. So this was the situation before the Battle of Trenton. It wasn't very peaceful. Each side was sending out skirmishers to see where the other guys were, and they occasionally got into little battles. So you couldn't totally relax. But the English and the Hessians, for some reason, felt, well, we have to wait till next spring and then we'll start again. And as a result, Washington came over, and we know what happened after that. A little later, the English started to find that they were not getting as many supplies as they could. And so they had what was called the Grand Forage in North Jersey and Central Jersey, where they would go around and either buy or take food and other kinds of materials that they needed. So again, there was a period of plunder and also a lot of antagonism between Jersey Tories and Jersey Americans. This is a list of all of the battles that occurred after the British took Philadelphia. This occurs from the British's attack on Philadelphia all the way through their withdrawal and sometime afterward. Okay, so we have the Battle of Trenton, Battle of Princeton. The Americans, after their victories, go up to Morristown in North Jersey, and the English go back to New York. Then when the season starts to get good again, the British start to come across New Jersey again, or no, the British start their attack on the Americans again, but they're not going to go overland. They're going to take ships and sail down the Jersey shore. And people were noticing the flotilla as they passed along the Jersey shore, so they kind of knew where they were at what particular time. The British then sailed on past Delaware and into Maryland and into the Chesapeake and landed at Head of Elk in Chesapeake Bay. And then all of these things that are in black are the battles that happened in Pennsylvania, and you sort of know about these through the capture of Philadelphia. Then the battles that are listed in red are ones that happened in New Jersey. And you could see that there was a conflict on the Delaware River, and this will get into the Battle of Red Bank. There was General Wayne's Forage in South Jersey, the Alloway Creek skirmish. And then after the British left, the Americans defeated them in Monmouth County at Monmouth Courthouse, although that was close to a tie. And then there was a punitive raid on Chestnut Neck, and I'll talk about each of these in a little while. This is just the way the British took Philadelphia, and it's not too important for us to deal with this particular thing. Once the British got into Philadelphia, people in Philadelphia were very happy about that. The Tories in Philadelphia were very happy about it. Most of them didn't want to separate from the king anyhow. And so they viewed the British army coming into Philadelphia as safety for them. And so what you have is a lot of the Tories and a lot of the British army start to fraternize with the local women and the local people. And that's what's depicted on the far left. The two small pictures in the middle show the British being attentive to the ladies. And the one in the middle just shows how the Tory ladies were quite happy with what was going on. The picture in the upper right was the dancing. There was a lot of dancing that went on in Philadelphia at that time with the British occupation. The lower middle is there was a lot of drinking going on, so there were a lot of drunkards. And then finally, near the end, the British held a big party because General Howe, who was in charge of the British forces, was being replaced, And so they gave him a big going away party called the Mischianza. And the British dressed up like medieval knights, and the Philadelphia Tory women dressed up like medieval ladies of the court. And they had this huge party. When this was happening, since the army was soaking up so many resources, the prices for everybody else went through the roof. Let me see if I can deal with this. Oh, that's better. You can see the prices that used to be for sugar were 58 shillings. Now it was 45 pounds. Meat was 3 halfpennies, and now it was 1 shilling. But what you're seeing here basically is the prices are going really high. And the picture on the left is Head House Square, which is still in Philadelphia, and so pretty much looks like that. And that's where a lot of these goods were sold. Whether you were a Tory or a pro-American, the prices were so expensive that there was a lot of poverty developing in Philadelphia, and people had trouble feeding their families. Now, this was the first of these major battles in this particular part of the revolution that took place in Jersey. The Americans decided to choke off supplies from Europe and the other colonies to the English by establishing Fort Mifflin on Mud Island on the left and Fort Mercer in Gloucester County, I think it is, on the right. And they had cannons which could cover the channels in between them, so this would stop the big ships. Down below, closer to Billingsport, they had what was called a chevaux de frise, which was basically just a chain which went across the channel with spikes in it to prevent the shipping from going up there. So the only way that the English could get there would be through the lesser channel closer to the Pennsylvania side. The Fort Mercer got attacked by the Hessians, by Colonel Donop. If you remember, he was the one who was up in Bordentown. His troops came down to wipe out Fort Mercer, but unfortunately, and that's what the picture in the upper right depicts, is they were badly, badly beaten by the American troops, mainly from Rhode Island, who were in the fort and caused the Hessians to retreat. Colonel Donop was mortally wounded and died, and there were lots and lots of soldiers who were left wounded. The English managed to get barges with cannons on them and started to shoot at Fort Mifflin on the other side of the river. And after a rather long battle and many American casualties, the Americans decided, let's just retreat and get out of here. So they abandoned the fort, and the English took it the next morning once the Americans had left, and they were hoping they would get the Americans, but they didn't. And so now the Americans went over to the Jersey side. So this was that thing that started to affect New Jersey. The Americans and the Germans and the English took over certain houses as their headquarters, certainly took a lot of the forage that they needed and other supplies to support their troops. Now here we get into South Jersey more. While the British were in Philadelphia, and after the winter at Valley Forge, the Americans, and to some extent the English, but certainly the Americans, were running low on supplies. There wasn't enough forage. There weren't enough shoes for the American troops. And so Washington sent General Wayne and a little bit later, Casimir Pulaski, to start to forage in South Jersey. So Wayne starts out in Wilmington, Delaware. He crosses the river down to Salem, goes up to Haddonfield. Now, the English were aware of this, and so they sent some troops over there to stop them, but they were repulsed, so that Wayne could then go on to Trenton and then back to Valley Forge with his goods. And he collected lots and lots of horses, lots and lots of forage. And at the same time, the forage he couldn't take, he burned so that the British couldn't get it, but also the Americans who were living there couldn't get it either. So this was Wayne's forage, which was successful. Now this marks one of the things that's described as a massacre in New Jersey and in the Revolutionary War. General Malwood and I guess he was a Colonel Simcoe of the Rangers came over and sailed down from Philadelphia and ended up in Salem. Now, the reason they did this was after Wayne's skirmish. The reason they did this is because they heard there were a lot of militia accumulating in Salem and Cumberland County, and they were there to attack them. So the first thing they did is they went from Salem to Thompson's Bridge, and that's the one that's the furthest to the east. And what they did was they crossed the bridge to the south side of the river, of the Alloways Creek, where there was a large farmhouse and outbuildings and a swamp. And Simcoe had his Rangers take over the house, take over the outbuildings, hide in the swamp. When the Americans came, Simcoe had some of his soldiers out on the road to attract their attention, and the Americans were on the north side of the river. They saw the British, came down the road, crossed the river, and once they crossed the river, they were attacked by all of Simcoe's troops on the other side. And the only reason that they weren't totally destroyed is another division of the militia came to help them escape from the ambush. Then Simcoe and Malwood go back to Salem, and this time they take barges out onto the Delaware and down to Alloways Creek on the mouth. Simcoe has the boats sent back to Salem because he doesn't want to give his soldiers an out. He wants them to fight and stand. So they march through 2 miles of swamp and get to Hancocks Bridge early in the morning. Now, there were some American troops stationed around Hancocks Bridge, and unbeknownst to Simcoe, the owners of the house, who were a couple of Quakers, were also there. Now, what he did was they were living in Hancocks Tavern at Hancocks Bridge, and this is Hancocks Tavern on the upper left and lower left. The 2 Quakers were sleeping in the attic, which is the thing in the upper right. And what happened was you could see the British in green. These are the Rangers, not the regular army. They came in and slaughtered the 2 Quakers thinking that they were British officers. They also slaughtered all of the other troops that were around there. And then went back and escaped and came back to Salem. They made another foray to try and get people at Quentin's Bridge. But when they got there, they found that there was nobody there. And so they went back to Salem, and then they went back to Philadelphia, having done some plundering of their own. Now the British left. The British left Philadelphia. And when you think about it, the British were not successful in Philadelphia because it never led to anything. They didn't take new territory. They just had to leave ultimately and go back to New York. Now, part of it was there was a change in leadership, and the new British leaders decided to go south. They were going to attack the South. And so the military operations in New Jersey by whole armies stopped. And so the type of war that we had became an insurgency. Whoops, not yet. Here's the British, the red line. The British left Philadelphia, went across central New Jersey up towards Sandy Hook, but were interrupted at Monmouth Courthouse in a major battle with the Americans, which turned out to be a tie or an American victory, depending on how you looked at it. The British went on to Sandy Hook. The Americans went back up to Morristown, and that ended the British sortie into Philadelphia and back. Now, there was a lot of money to be made by merchants who would rent or buy ships and rent or hire a crew and go out and plunder the enemy's shipping. They were allowed to do this because the government would give them what was called a letter of marque, which was permission to be a pirate if you started to steal stuff from the other side. So the privateers, as they were called, would try and seize another armies, the British ships or the American ships, depending on which side they were on, and steal all their goods, bring them back to Philadelphia or to whatever harbor they were in, and then auction them off. So that it was an easy way to make money so long as you were successful. The downside was that you could be captured and destroyed. And so all of the money that you spent on the capital costs would be lost. Okay. A lot of the American privateers were coming out of Chestnut Neck on the Molucca. Now, there was a fair amount of travel between Philadelphia and the Molucca, so that whatever shipping would come in could be either sold there at Chestnut Neck or moved by wagons up to Philadelphia. Now, this was happening fairly frequently in 1778, and the British got tired of it, and they wanted to make a punitive raid to stop it. So in early 1778, they sent down some ships to find out where these harbors were. And when they got to the Molucca or the Chestnut Neck area, they found that the ships they had were too big to safely get across the bars that were in the inlets. And so but at least they scoped out what they needed to see and managed to get a pilot to come along with them in October to help them get through the various obstacles that they had to sail through. In October 6th, a flotilla of ships, including one a ship of the line, a big warship, came down to the Molucca, and they entered the Molucca River and attacked and burnt down Chestnut Neck. And I found this picture of this depiction of Chestnut Neck, and I think it's kind of neat because you get a sense of what the town must have been like. And if you think about it for a second, you have these sailing ships in there. They have to have places to put the stuff that they've got. Their goods have to be stored somewhere. So there were warehouses. There was housing for the sailors and the captains. There were taverns. And then there were people who were making money selling stuff. So it was a little town at that point, and it was totally burned down. The ultimate objective would have been Batstow, because Batstow was making cannonballs and military things for the Americans. But the English were not quite so comfortable going through the Pine Barrens to get to Batstow. So they were staying in Chestnut Neck when a turncoat from the, it was the other way around. They started to move up into Ocean County, into the area around Tucker and Little Lake Harbor. And Washington was aware that the attack on Chestnut Neck had happened. So he sent Casimir Pulaski and his troops down to Ocean County, to Little Lake Harbor, to defend that area. And Pulaski sent DeBozen, who was one of his officers, to set up a picket post in front to keep his eye on what's going on at Chestnut Neck. One of the Americans was a turncoat. And so he came from Chestnut Neck. Oh, wait, pardon me. One of the British troops was a turncoat and went down to Chestnut Neck. and told the people there of a special way to get back up to where de Bozen was and attack them. So they secretly went through the marshes and up and massacred de Bozen's pickets and his troops at that point. And that's what the picture on the right shows, is a British grenadier bayoneting an American. So this was one of the last battles that occurred in New Jersey. After the British left New Jersey, so this was in later parts of 1778, it was payback time. Nobody expects the American Inquisition. And here we have some figures from the Inquisition in the various counties and the number of people who they inquired about to see if they were supporting the English in any way. And so you can see there were a lot of inquisitions going on in various places. Now, in addition, there's some information from Gloucester County, which talks about those people who were found to be supporters of the English and were hanged. So you have lists of people who were hanged because they were supporting the English. And one of the things that just strikes me as odd is if you catch the name on the bottom on the right-hand side of the British list, a guy named Gideon Urin, that's a really unfortunate last name. I guess he must have been pissed off. Okay, so much for jokes. No, that's not right. Now, the troops themselves were not well behaved, and each division of the American Army and the British Army wrote orderly books. These were the events that happened on a daily basis. And one of the things they recorded were the court-martials. And so what you see here this is the American Army and their court-martials. The numbers on the top represent the court-martials against the people around the troops. In other words, these were the crimes against the civilians. The crimes against the civilians. And what you could see is the various charges that they were charged with: abuse, theft, horse theft, theft of a slave, plunder, non-payment of bills, extortion, so on and so forth. The lower list are the charges that the soldiers were court-martialed for crimes against the government. Now, anybody working for the government knows that embezzlement is not a difficult thing to do at times. And so these people were stealing government goods, theft from the government, the cowardice a couple of times, conduct unbecoming, absent without leave, desertion, mutiny, and others. So what you have here are the soldiers are not all nice people. They're kind of unscrupulous. Some of the time it gets focused on the citizens. Some of the time it gets focused on the government. But the British did it too. And so you can see in the British Army, these were people who were court-martialed there for various crimes. And some of them were against the British government. Some of them are against the surrounding citizens. So you have things like espionage, embezzlement, drunkenness can be anywhere, guiding rebels, highway robbery, home break-ins and assaults, killing a hog, murder, and so on. So the English had their own criminals who were exposing themselves to the New Jersey public. Okay. Now, after the English armies left New Jersey, an insurgency developed. In other words, now you have a different kind of war in New Jersey. It's with militia groups that are smaller. It's with individual citizens who may be pro-American or pro-British, mainly pro-British. And they were going around New Jersey causing all kinds of havoc. And here we have pictures of all of these people. Now, the people who were living, a lot of people started to hide out in the Pine Barrens and in various places. And these were mainly Tories who saw that the war was not doing well. And so they were heading more towards New Jersey, some of them to go ultimately to Sandy Hook and then New York. But they were in New Jersey and they were outlaws. The reason they could be there, the reason why there could be refugees, was there was little or no civil authority. So there was no government, there were no police in most of the parts of New Jersey, so you could probably get away with almost anything. There were a lot of escaped felons, and you saw these in the newspapers. They escaped from jails, they escaped from the military units. There were a lot of people who plundered homes and farms because once you were out there, you needed to feed yourself and clothe yourself. And so the easiest thing to do was to steal things from the locals. They were highway robbers, and hiding in the forest gave them lots and lots of cover. So it was a good place to be a thief, and these thieves tended to be what called refugees who were pro-British. They were Tories. And I did it again. Now, who were the refugees? There were a lot of runaway slaves. There were a lot of runaway indenture servants. There were a lot of army deserters. There was a fair amount of British militia. There were pro-British banditti, just thieves who were sort of for the British. There were occasionally vagrant Indians and deserting sailors. So you had all of these people hiding out in the Pine Barrens in New Jersey. The graph on the lower left shows the New Jersey regiments, and these are the people who escaped. These are the people who ran away from service. And so you can see from these various units the number of people who ran away. The figure on the upper right is the number of men, women, and slaves who ran away from their owners or the people they worked for. And these were advertised in the local newspapers, the runaways. So here we have runaways, there we have deserters, and here we have some slaves who were hiding out also in the Pine Barrens, and they're a special case because the African Americans are actually quite active in a lot of New Jersey during the Revolution. The one who is the most well-known is Colonel Ty, who shows up in Turn. He's the picture in the upper middle. What happened was this: Governor Dunmore of Virginia offered the slaves their freedom if they fought for the British. A lot of slaves took up the bid. So it was something that was starting to unsettle a lot of people because they were losing their workforce. One of the people who was enslaved was this guy named Titus Cornelius, who was enslaved by John Corliss in Monmouth County. And John Corliss was one of the last Quakers to own slaves, and he refused to give them up. Cornelius escaped and changed his name to Colonel Ty. He actually ruled, was the officer of a mixed militia band of white and black soldiers. And that was not that uncommon in Monmouth County at that time. The refugees were all fighting against the Americans. And so Ty was responsible for bringing lots and lots of troops, lots and lots of soldiers, militia, down into Monmouth County, hunting for American officers and hunting for stuff that the army needed. The thing in the lower middle is the runaway advertisement by Corliss for Titus Cornelius. Now, there was a lot of mayhem going on in rural New Jersey. And what these were the refugees or the banditti who were basically stealing from everybody, maybe helping the English a little bit, but they stole from everybody and pretty much kept it for themselves. They were different bands in different parts of Jersey. So that, for instance, the Woodward gang was in Upper Freehold, an unnamed gang was in Monmouth County. Jacob Fagan and Lewis Fenton were in along the Manasquan River. John Bacon and Captain Steelman were along the Jersey shore. Joseph Mulliner was on the Mullica River along with William Viberson. and so on and so forth. So you have all of these gangs that are functioning at that time, which is making life very difficult for most of the normal people. Now, this didn't happen in South Jersey, but there was fear of this in North Jersey. There were a lot of Indian attacks going on in Northeast Jersey, right across the Delaware. And so people in Sussex County and to some extent Hunterdon were afraid of Indian attacks on their settlements. But this, again, didn't happen in New Jersey. Now, this was one of those cause celebs that happened in every war. There was My Lai in Vietnam. There was Abu Ghraib in Iraq. And there was the case of Jane McCrae during the Revolutionary War. And what happened was Jane McCrae was engaged to a British officer and was coming to visit him as Burgoyne advanced through New York. So this didn't happen in Jersey. Some Indians found her, killed her, and scalped her. And she was known for having a very nice head of hair. The Indians, for some reason, went back to the British headquarters, and the British officers recognized the hair, the scalp, had belonged to Jane McCrae. Now, this got a lot of publicity. This was a big, big issue. And what it did was it caused a lot of fear among the American colonists that the Indians were going to come and slaughter them. And this was a really atrocious kind of episode. So the Battle of Jane McCrae was the scalping of Jane McCrae was had a lot of impact. And this is a painting by John Vanderlyn, who was one of the major artists in the beginning of the 19th century. Now, my students love this. There was a book called Kate Aylesworth, Heiress of Sweetwater. It was a novel written in the middle of the 19th century by Charles Peterson. And it was about a Tory woman from a wealthy family at Sweetwater. And she fell in love with an American captain. And the two of them were romantically attached. She was kidnapped by Joe Mulliner, one of the banditti that I showed before. And this is sort of like what would happen in the lower middle. There's Mulliner attacking a stagecoach. He captured Kate Aylesworth and took her into the swamps in South Jersey near Sweetwater. And there's a picture of a swamp near Sweetwater. And eventually she gets rescued and they live happily ever after. And Joe Mulliner is eventually killed and captured and hanged. That's supposedly their house, the Sweetwater house in the lower right. Now, the picture on the lower left is from The Sopranos. And teaching South Jersey students, they can tell when people talk about the Pine Barrens, whether it's fantasy or not. And this was a scene where two of Tony Soprano's underlings get a Russian mafia guy and they kill him out in the Pine Barrens. And when the students looked at it and there's a mountain in the background and a lake, they knew that this was not the Pine Barrens. So they found that kind of funny. The other thing, there was an episode of The X-File where people are talking about people hanging out in caves in the Pine Barrens. And that too seems a little strange. Now, this is the business about privateers, and you could see that there were lots and lots of privateering going on. It was a major way to make money during the Revolution. Here is a cost of living chart that shows you how the cost of living just skyrocketed from 1779 to 1783. So during the Revolution, the inflation was very, very high. Now, the reason for this was the Americans were insisting that farmers and businessmen take American currency, not English currency. And American currency was more shaky and less reliable. And so it naturally led to inflation. Now, as soon as the Americans switched to a gold standard or to a species, you could see that the prices stabilized. And so after the Revolution, at least the cost of living came under control. Some people after the Revolution filed claims to get money for what they had lost. And what you have here on the left are the claims by the people in Pennsylvania, and on the right, the people from New Jersey. Both legislatures gallantly accepted these lists and these claims, and none of them were ever paid. Now, the last thing I'd like to talk about are some of the people who actually experienced the revolution themselves and were writing either letters or journals. And there are three people I want to talk about. William Allen of Philadelphia was from a very well-established family. His father was the person for whom Allentown was named. He was a Tory, fairly wealthy, and living in Philadelphia. Nicholas Colleen, interesting character. He was a Swedish Lutheran minister who was the pastor at Raccoon or Swedesboro, Penn's Neck, and traveled to Morris River and even to some extent to the Mullica River. He was there from 1770 for a long, long time, all the way through the American Revolution. He was a neutral. And the reason was he was a Swede, so he wasn't a citizen of America or Britain. Also, he was a pacifist, and so he took no side in the revolution, and this was going to cause him a problem. The last person is little Sally Wister, who was a 16-year-old girl who was living outside of Philadelphia in North Wales. And each of them had a slightly different experience of the American Revolution. Okay, James Allen wrote the following. Let's see if I can move this out of the way. Yeah. James Allen wrote this: "I'm afraid to converse with persons here or write to my friends in Philadelphia, and small matters such as a letter intercepted or unguarded word would plunge me into trouble. And this was February 1777. This was before the British came. Now, before the British came, Philadelphia was having a lot of problems. The Americans, the pro-American faction, was being very obstreperous. And if you didn't put a candle in your window at night, they would think you were a Tory and they would break your windows. So there was a lot of vandalism going on by the part of the pro-Americans on the homes and the people who were Tories. And so this is kind of what he's talking about. He also wrote, though the Congress have always sat and have given most of the offices to people living in it, Philadelphia, yet they can hardly find reputable men to accept employment and complain of much of the disaffection there. In other words, the services were starting to degenerate, that the pro-Americans were putting their own people in charge. And so the Tories were having a more difficult time going about doing their business. I ran some risk in continuing in Jersey when the wantonness of oppression has exceeded all description, the government being in the hands of the most low-lived, hot-brained Presbyterians. This shows this shows a lot of prejudice. A lot of the Quakers and a lot of the Episcopals had trouble with the Presbyterians because the Presbyterians were largely pro-American. And so they were supporting the American cause, whereas the other guys weren't. And it's odd, considering the Presbyterians I know, to refer to them as low-lived and hot-brained seems a little bit extreme. Finally, my situation continues as before, living in perpetual fear of being robbed, plundered, and insulted. All ideas of property give way to the slightest pretend of public demands, and the meanest of the people in offices play the tyrant over the most respectable with impunity. In other words, the Americans were taking whatever they needed from the Tory households. Okay. I find this the most valuable thing that I've come across, and I see I've misspelled Nicholas. Okay. Nicholas Colleen kept this diary, and I'd like to read some parts of it. As far as the occupation of New York is concerned, well, that's the wrong one. Okay, here we go. Already this year, 1776, there was much anxiety about the war. In the spring, some warships came up into the river and fought against the American galleys a quarter of a mile from the Penn's Neck Church. After the English army defeated the Americans, captured New York, and spread itself over New Jersey, there was constant alarm. Formerly, all the people were eager to take part, but now, as the fire came closer, many drew away, and there was much dissension among the people. Many concealed themselves in the woods or within their houses. Other people were forced to carry arms. Others offered opposition and refused to go. The people were afraid to visit the church because the authorities would take the opportunity to both take the horses and the men. So this is what his reactions were before the British were in Philadelphia. Now, he was present right after the Battle of Red Bank. Because there were so many Hessian soldiers there, a lot of people came up to see what the battlefield was like after the battle. This was the day after. And he came up there, he's a foreigner. He came up and he only said he wanted to see what was there. And of course, the Americans grabbed him and were going to put him in jail and shoot him. But fortunately, other people interceded for him and he was cleared, and so he was allowed to go. One of the services he rendered was that since there were a lot of Hessians, a lot of Germans who were wounded and in hospitals, many of them dying, and he was a minister who spoke German, he served them in their last hours. And so that was a major comfort he gave to the soldiers in his role as a minister. Okay. Now, he was also there when Anthony Wayne was doing his foraging in South Jersey. In fact, Wayne stayed at his house in Swedesboro and was about to go to sleep, Wayne was, when word came that the British were hot on his heels. So he got dressed and all of the army, he left Colin's house, and the army escaped northward just in time because the British came in a few minutes later and came into town. So he was there and talking with Wayne and taking care of him. Okay, a skirmish at Raccoon. The refugees and the British troops surrounded Swedesboro and were starting to shoot at the town and lob cannons and cannon shots into the town. They burned down the schoolhouse and set lots of the area to fire. But fortunately, the Americans were able to ward them off and they escaped. So there was some damage to Swedesboro at that time, and he was there watching this going on. Okay. In addition, when the British were in Swedesboro, they left their horses and their men stayed in the church and left it in terrible condition. He was very upset by that. Now, when the British left, he wrote the following. From all this, it is apparent how terrible the Civil War raged It's interesting. He's characterizing the insurgency as a civil war, which it was. Although during the whole time only one man was shot, because both parties fought not like real men with swords and guns, but like robbers and incendiaries. The fact that no important detachments were stationed here contributed greatly towards such barbaric license, as the province was too wild and of less importance, so that straggling plundering so that parties of poor soldiers and poor officers were allowed to proceed with pleasure. And then finally, at the end of the war, he wrote, though there are no war disturbances now, 1780, party hatreds flamed in the hearts of people and at times broke out in quarrels and fights. He was still the minister there, and his congregation was half Tory and half pro-American, and so it was still a very uncomfortable place to be. So he sort of saw a lot of this stuff. He was imprisoned a couple of times, but he left an interesting record of what had happened. Now, on a lighter note, little Sally Worcester was 16 years old, and she wrote a series of letters to her friend, Debbie Norris, and they were living on the American side of the line around Philadelphia. So they never actually saw any British soldiers, but this is what she wrote. I feel in good spirits, though surrounded by an army, the house full of officers, the yard alive with soldiers, very peaceable sort of men though. They eat like other folks, talk like them, and behave themselves with elegance. So I will not be afraid of them, that I won't. So you can just imagine a sort of a 16-year-old girl being surrounded by all of these army officers in uniforms, and some anxiety, but also the kinds of interests that a teenage girl would have. Another letter. Oh, gracious Debbie, I am all alive with fear. The English have come out to attack as we imagine our army. They are on Chestnut Hill, our army 3 miles this side. What will become of us, only 6 miles distant? And then finally, and this is the greatest thing, I dare say there is impatience to know I dare say thee is impatient to know my sentiments of the officers, so which somnus embraces them, and the house is still, and take the character according to their ranks. In other words, the officers are sleeping, and she's describing them to Debbie Norris. Captain Furnival, I need not say more of him than he has exceptionally one or two. He has, excepting one or two, the handsomest face I ever saw. A very fine person, fine light hair, and a great deal of it adds to the beauty of his face. So even though it was a war, she had other things on her mind. Then the British left in 1883, and they all left out of New York. The last troops left from Staten Island, and that was all she wrote. So this was just a beginning of what kinds of things people could experience during the American Revolution. And it certainly wasn't a pleasant time to be a citizen of New Jersey. Thank you. Oh.
All right, Claude, thanks a lot, man. That was a great recap to, really get the idea about what life was like during the Revolutionary War.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh. All right, if anybody has questions, now would be a great time to call in. The number is here. I did notice there was a number of people watching live, so we may get a question or two. You never know.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you think about it, while the troops were in, it was daunting, but even all the way through, there was something going on the whole time.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, I've heard, South Jersey, the war to shore described as a civil war in a lot of ways because of those, the different loyalist factions compared to the more patriotic folks. And it was, like you said, kind of constant friction all the time.
Mhm.
Yeah, we hear those stories today of the Pine robbers, scoundrels like we hear about John Bacon and Joe Mulliner. Of course, he's known as the dancing. He was known to go to all the local hoedowns and dance. And the old story was, I guess that's how they captured him one time, is they knew they had a dance, he'd show up, and that's how they were able to eventually catch him.
I had a friend who was a expert on social dancing in the 18th century in America.
Hmm.
And I asked her, what kind of dances did Joe Mulliner do? And she said that most of the time people in taverns like that would be doing a jig, an individual jig. So it would be one guy doing fancy footwork, clogging, maybe tap dancing, that sort of thing.
Neat. Yeah, you always wonder what it would have been like in all those old taverns back in the day. I always envisioned some fiddle playing in the background, and lots of wine or rum, whatever they had on tap locally. It probably wouldn't be up to today's standards, but I'm sure for the day, it was acceptable. But all those old taverns, man, they were so important because that's pretty much where everybody got information. They were like the kind of keys to the castle, really. That's where if something was going to happen, that's where you heard about it, and they played a really important role.
Yeah, well, a lot of people were illiterate, and so those people who could read newspapers, or those people who could bring news from the outside, would be sort of like local celebrities at the taverns and just tell everybody what was going on, whether it was correct or not.
Okay, you can't don't let the truth get in the way of a good story.
Yeah, right. Especially when you're getting loaded.
Right. Yeah. All right. Well, it's getting close to about well after 11. So I guess at this time maybe we're not going to have any calls today, but that's all right. And I want to thank you, Claude. That was really interesting to look at life during the Revolutionary War. A couple days is July 4th. So I always hear about the price of freedom isn't always free. So I'm sure a lot of people, really had a rough time. And fortunately today we're in a much more safer and pleasant society in some ways. So
I'm also glad we won the revolution.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you,
all right,
Joe.
Claude, thank you very much. Next week we're going to take the week off, and we're getting ready for our summer short course, which is going to be July 15th. We've got 2 venues. We're going to be operating out of Wells Mills. There's a canoe trip and a hike there. And then over at Whites Bog Village, we have a number of education programs and tours. And you can sign up now. You can go through the Pinelands Commission website, or you can also find it at Stockton's Continuing Studies office. We work with them to put on the short course. And registration is now open. So it's going to be our return to in-person programming. It's going to be all outdoors, and it's going to be July 15th. So that's going to be our next venture. Will be the 5th annual Pinelands Summer Short Course at both Wells Mills and Whites Bog Village. So with that, stay cool, and we'll see you out there.